Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Joyce Purnick's column, Metro Matters, in the New York Times is about New York's people, institutions, and politics. She gets down to the real nitty-gritty of the city's business, using her very sharp eye and her much common sense. Thank you so much. I was thinking today of how many years I have known you, but you were very young.
Too many to say on air, many years.
But you were in college when I met you.
I was in college, indeed. I was an intern, the real kind, for
What do you mean by that? Not paid? What does that mean? You mean,
I'm referring
you mean
to
Monica Lewinsky.
yes,
Oh, sorry, I didn't get that.
Going to invoke her name, but
yes,
I was a
right.
hard-working intern. It was a program that Barnard College had with Senator Robert Kennedy. I think he was the one with the other senator too, but in any case, I chose to work for Robert Kennedy, and I would go down to his office in the post office on 45th Street a few times a week and work often on case studies, often on social welfare case studies. People would write to the senator and say, we're having a problem with X, Y, or Z, and then minions like us would try to unravel the problem, get to the bottom of it, and of course you were there. That's how we met.
And then you went to work on the campaign.
I went to work on the campaign, but it was very, of course, short-lived because so was Senator Kennedy.
So that was a political activity, and you really, I assume if you're working on the campaign, you would have liked to have seen him become president.
I wanted to learn about politics. Even then, and it was going to sound funny, but I wasn't partisan. I was just curious, and I thought, this was very conscious on my part, I thought that if I worked in politics, I would be a better reporter of politics. I wanted to be a reporter. I always wanted to be a reporter, and I had struggled to get a job in journalism before I went, after I got out of Barnard, before I went to work for Kennedy, and I couldn't get a job because I wasn't experienced enough to work in a New York newspaper, and I just didn't want to leave New York. I was reared in New York, born and reared in New York, and I felt I really knew New York government and politics better than most, and I wanted to stay in New York.
So what made you want to be a reporter? Where did you get that idea?
I think the main reason is that my mother, who was a very, very smart woman, encouraged me to write because, this was long before Larry Summers, and I'm not validating what he said at all, but I was terrible in math and science. And that was in the period when you were supposed to be good in math and science. We were trying to beat the Russians, remember, who had put up Sputnik before we put up a satellite. So the focus of public education at the time was math and science. And I did very badly in math and science. So my mother knew that I loved to read, and she assumed if I loved to read, maybe I would be a fairly good writer. So she encouraged it, and I started writing stories in, I guess it was elementary school, and I started working for my school paper in junior high school, public school, and then Jamaica High School. I was an editor of our high school paper, and on and on. It was just something I sort of gravitated towards. It wasn't any, and there's one more thing, I think, and that is John Kennedy, and ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that energized me to get into the public arena, but I was never comfortable in partisan politics.
That's really interesting, because I was going to ask you if you minded just being a reporter and not being a participant.
No, I mean, it was all very deliberate. I had never any intention of staying in politics. It was, I'll learn about politics, I'll meet some people, and maybe I'll meet some reporters, and I'll work my way into a newspaper.
That's fair. And then, so what was your first job?
My first job was as a clerk at the New York Post. And I got that job, I didn't get it immediately after the campaign. I did some writing with a management consulting firm because I couldn't get to a newspaper. But then I read this profile in the New Yorker magazine of Dorothy Schiff. And she was the editor-in-chief and publisher of the New York Post. And for you young'uns who don't know, the old New York Post was a tabloid, but it was a very literate, almost sedate tabloid. It's nothing like the Murdoch tabloid. It was a place that nurtured writers. Ellen Dudar was there, and Fern Maria Ekman was there. Women had quite a chance. Ultimately, a year or two after I got there, Anna Quinlan, and some men too, Warren Hogue, Clyde Haberman. We had a great stable of people. So I read this profile in the New Yorker and said that Dorothy Schiff made sure that all the letters that were written to her were answered. So I wrote her a letter. And I said, I don't know whether to believe what I read in the New Yorker, but if it's true, then someone will answer this. And so what I'm asking that someone to do is please consider me for a job at the New York Post. I will do anything. I really wrote this next line. I can't believe it. I said, I will sweep floors. I just want a chance to learn journalism.
So when I went to work for John Lindsay and he said, what would title, I said, and how much money do you want? I said, well, I'll need my husband says, I need $25,000 or I'll have to come as an au pair girl. So, I mean, we're even. But last week I had on the program Pete Hamill. And he was talking about how he started writing, and he wrote a letter to Jimmy Wexler, who at the time was the editor of the Post. Actually, he didn't. He wrote letters to the editor, and Wexler one day said to him, have you ever thought of becoming a reporter? Come and try out. So it's really fascinating. I asked him, and I'd ask you, do you think that kind of thing could happen today?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I do.
Yeah.
Did he? Did Pete think
He thought no.
I do. I think that people who are, I mean, I'm not saying I'm particularly talented, but people who have the drive, people who really want to be journalists, I think it's more and more competitive, but there are still ways in, and cream still rises to the top. And there's one other thing. There's a great openness at newspapers. There's nothing that editors like more than to see a young person unexpectedly show so much talent that he or she can't be stopped. Now, that can lead to abuses, as we learned at the New York Times, but it can also lead to discovery of wonderful talents.
You've been a reporter, a bureau chief. You were the head of City Hall services.
First woman.
Very good. An editor.
First woman Metro editor.
And now you're a columnist.
Yes.
Do you have a preference?
I loved every job I did when I did it, except editing. I was not particularly attuned to editing. I wasn't a great manager, and you have to be a very good manager.
So when you're an editor,
patient.
When you're an editor, you participate in the assignments or what the news is going to be that's going to get covered?
Sure. And
then Then you have to see that everybody does it.
You're accountable up, and you're accountable down. You're right in the middle, and some people thrive at being editors, one of whom, my husband, Max Frankel, was the head editor at the New York Times, the executive editor, and he was a brilliant editor, now retired. I just wasn't cut out for it. And you've got to really be able to roll with the punches. You've got to do all those cliches. You've got to let, be like a duck and let the water roll off, roll off, what's the phrase, let the water roll off your back. Right. You have to be able to take a lot and keep your cool. And remember that your focus is journalism and not bureaucracy. And it really wasn't.
It's very hard.
It wasn't for me.
And now, you've always really, though, concentrated on New York City?
Yes, and New York City and state as well. I was in Albany as well, and I write a lot, not as much, but a lot about Albany.
So the news of the city, so you're really an urban expert and an expert in the city. I
suppose.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you were running the city?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
what's the rest of the question?
Well, how would you, you've got so much knowledge now, and you're dispassionate. And since you don't have the political pressures that other people have, what has to be done to make a city thrive? I'm not saying it's not thriving, because I think it is. But.
Well, I think that actually a lot of it has been done over the last several years. I think that our governance has improved. And those who are staunch Democrats won't like to hear me say this, but I think that if you assess how Bloomberg has handled this city, which is basically as a technocrat, not a politician, although he's had to learn how to kiss babies and all that nonsense.
Or trying to learn.
And he's trying
he's
to,
learning.
Yeah, and he's spending a heck of a lot of time in Staten Island and in the boroughs, and I don't know how much he actually enjoys that, although he says he does. But I think that a lot of the decisions that he's made, the decisions on the budget and the decision to develop the 311 system, I think a lot of the decisions have been pretty good. But I would also say something else to New Yorkers, which is that by and large, the success or failure of the city of New York tracks the success or failure of the economy.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's something, and people tend to blame the top guy, so far it's all been guys, but the top person, for what's happening in the city, when in fact we're creatures of the state, and we are seriously influenced by what's happening in the national economy and how that touches us. We were already going into trouble before 9/11 because of the economy. We had a recession on.
Right.
People forget that, and they blame 9/11 for the city's problems in the following year and a half, 2 years. That's another thing. There's only so much that mayors can do. I think that Giuliani's focus, and Democrats won't like to hear me say this either, but I think his focus on crime is right. I don't think he deserves or Bratton or any of the people who were serving at the time. I don't think they deserve all the credit for what happened, but they deserve for the drop in crime because it was a national phenomenon. But they deserve
But it
some
was
of
a national phenomenon, right?
Yes. So something was going on.
It's another reflection, though.
The main thing was, I think, the end of the crack epidemic, which is a fascinating phenomenon. But nonetheless, I think some of the strategies are very important, and I think Giuliani deserves credit for focusing on that. He could have mishandled it too.
Yeah, I'm one of those Democrats who really, I can be very critical of the Democrats, but I'm also exceedingly critical of Mr. Giuliani and his way of doing stuff, but it's all right. I agree. I mean, I'm not
I've been, there are things to criticize, as you know, I've done that, but I think on this, the single-minded focus, I think, was important.
John Lindsay was the mayor, though, who really tied it most to national interests, wasn't he? I mean, there was a time when he, for instance, said we should have one tax. Should be collected by the federal government, reimbursed back to the state and cities. He organized the Conference of Mayors to say that this is a national urban problem. He tried.
Yeah, he tried to make it a more national focus.
Yeah. And it was an interesting thing, and it really kind of died after that.
It did. It didn't sustain itself. Yeah. Even at the time, I don't think it didn't catch on.
Yeah. No. I think part of the problem was that he ran for president, and that was a mistake. Now, what is the role of the political parties in the running of this city?
I think less and less, don't you?
I think the political parties are practically non-existent, but I think there are individual fiefdoms that really do exert undue pressure. Yeah. I mean, undue influence.
Well, absolutely. There's still patronage, and we know what's going on. And I think the major remnant and most destructive is in the court system.
Well, I think also in the organization of the city council, the way that all happens, that's all dictated by a few people, and it's so insane when you think about it.
Well, even the fact that Mike Bloomberg, who's obviously a Democrat, there's really no secret about that, but he said point blank in a recent interview, if I ran in the Democratic primary today, I'd lose. Right. Because the cards would be stacked against
do we need to have a partisan government?
I mean, we've looked at nonpartisan elections in the city. Bloomberg tried to get a vote on it, you may remember, and it failed. He did get a vote on it, it failed. Was it a referendum? I can't remember. I think it was a referendum. I think that people don't know really what the impact of that would be, and so they decided to stick with the old rather than to adopt something new that was not clear what impact it would have.
Because it's interesting when you think about it, the parties are really dying all over. The Bronx, I guess they're the healthiest in, but Queens has got some cracks. Brooklyn is a mess. And Manhattan doesn't have a real strong
Not really,
Democratic
but it's always been the weakest.
Right. And people here are pretty smart voters if they vote, it seems to me, generally on a wide scale.
Do we need them? I think they will probably die on the vine over the years.
It would seem to me, and especially with a candidate like Bloomberg. And so I think that you come to election time and people feel, well, you have to run a Democrat. So what does that mean? It means you've had one government in for 4 years, and then you have to change the government and bring all new people in, and how many of those will be political appointments, and then you start all over again. It doesn't make any sense.
Probably won't happen, though.
Right. And now let's go to Albany. I mean, you do talk a little bit about, you pay attention still to
Albany? Oh, yes. I think Albany is in a meltdown. I think that I do. I'm not saying this lightly. I think the dimensions of the fiscal problems, which we now use the phrase fiscal crisis so often that it's lost its punch. There's a real fiscal crisis up there. It's not only the budget gap, it's also a long-term deficit and an enormous amount of borrowing. We are in debt. We're on hock up to here. And the Medicaid costs are so great in the state, and in the localities have to pay part of it. In most other states, the state pays the whole thing. Here, we can't afford it. There's one thing after another.
The education
just a mess.
Funding that is
education
due and
funding.
There's no money.
As your viewers probably know, there was a lawsuit, and the ultimate decision was, it was a lawsuit by education advocates. The ultimate decision was that Albany owed New York City more money. The decision was, 2 years ago?
Right, and we still haven't seen it. Right. And then we come to the Metropolitan Transit Authority, Transportation Authority.
Lordy, yes.
Which is an agency by itself.
Well, my major criticism, and this is not a new criticism, and it's certainly not mine alone, is the nature of authorities. I think that they were created, in fact, we could probably document if we wanted to, that authorities, not just the MTA, there are others, They were created to insulate public officials because the mayor and the governor don't answer for problems directly because the MTA is run by their appointees. Now, Pataki has the majority of appointees, but how many people out there even know that? So they look to Calico, who's the head of it, or they look to Katie Lapp, who's the executive director, if they even know that name, who's there at the behest of the governor, as is Calico. But they're the ones who answer for the problems, and the guy who's the head of New York City Transit, who's the one who said it was going to take
6 years.
It takes 6 years for the Sea Line to come back, which now it looks like it might be today. The whole thing makes the structure is wasteful, and it allows, like the old Board of Education did, for a diffusion of responsibility. I think it has to be changed.
So, and there's also though the role of transportation, which is so critical to the city and to the state, is so important. And yet the state and the city have cut back on their contributions and increasingly are trying to make it so that it's a system paid for by the passengers or by borrowing.
That's right.
And that causes lots of problems. And the fact that it isn't part of them. Where would you put it, though?
Well, I think one of the problems in the MTA is that the MTA is responsible not just for the buses and the subways, but for the transportation system that includes the suburban railroads. And so there's a tension between suburbanites and city residents, which is not a good one for the city because suburbanites are powerful, very powerful when it comes to politics and elections.
And the weight they carry in the state.
And the weight they carry in Albany. Where would I put the money? I would put it in long-term maintenance. I would put it in investment and things. I mean, why, for example?
But if you were not to have it as an authority, where would the agency be?
Oh, I think it
has to be in the state.
I think it probably has to be a direct gubernatorial agency. But maybe maybe the subway and the buses should be mayoral. Yeah. And the rest should be state.
Very complicated. And then when you have something like the commuter tax, which the state legislature controls.
Well, what commuter tax?
There is no commuter tax, but the commuters are using the city's things, so that it's a hodgepodge in the whole state. Do you think we should have a constitutional convention?
I do. I mean,
should it be limited as to what it could be about?
It should be limited, although I think by definition, and I could be wrong, we have to ask Mario Cuomo this, the reigning expert, but I think once you call a convention, anything can be put on the agenda. So you can call it for, say, to reform the MTA, and then it can be anything. And that's always been the reason that voters have been leery of it, because they're afraid if they call a constitutional convention, then anything can go on the agenda, and including things that they don't want discussed.
You wrote an article at the beginning of the year with all the different things, and in a way it answered some of my basic question about what would you do if you could do some of this stuff, right? And one of them was the property tax.
Yeah.
Now that certainly...
Property tax is a classic mess. It always has been, because it favors certain groups and it doesn't favor other groups, and that's sort of a built-in fix.
And it's so complicated.
And it's so nobody wants to touch it.
And people don't understand it.
Yeah.
I mean, as a member of the city council, I can vouch that 75% of the members of the city council did not understand
But you did, I'm sure.
Well, I understood it to a degree.
Yeah.
I tried to understand it. And I was always against what they were proposing.
Yeah,
but it is, I mean, it's such an imbalance. It's got suburban communities paying less taxes than city people.
And city residents.
Except that city residents who live in private homes pay much less than anybody.
Than the co-op resident.
Right.
Yeah,
and apartment dwellers. I mean, just apartments in general. Apartments are the ones that are taxed the highest.
And of course, for many years, and I suspect this is still true, but I haven't looked at it in the last few weeks, the homeowners who lived in the boroughs were taxed at a very low rate. It's gone up somewhat, but still, comparatively speaking, and there was an argument for that. It's like, we don't want to lose.
But they were most likely paying less taxes than the neighboring suburbs. So how would you lose them? Where would you lose them?
That's right.
The argument was we don't want to lose them.
That was the argument. That was the argument of Peter Vallone, who was the head of the city council, and from Queens would make that argument.
And most of the members of the city council I would consider suburban members. They are in New York City. Manhattan is considered the urban center of New York City by
But there's
them.
one more factor. A lot of people move out of New York City because they believe they can, with paying a little more residential tax, property tax, send their kids to the public schools. So I think the feeling was, if you raise it to parity, People will
Just
think
not worth
it's, they'll have to send their kids to private or parochial school, not worth it.
And there's a new phenomenon also is that poor people are moving out of New York City.
Yeah.
Far away because they can't afford to live here.
Yeah. Well, we have I mean, that's
The housing.
terrible
business is
housing
the thing.
shortage.
Do you have, do you make judgments about the qualities of public officials?
Sure. You have to.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you'll see overt judgments in my column because it's sort of not what I'm supposed to do.
Hidden. Yeah.
But yes, of course I do. Otherwise, I have to know what I think about the information that some people are giving me. Is this somebody whose judgment I can trust? Yes, I do make judgments, but
And do you listen to the rhetoric and still listen? Take it seriously. I find this to be a personal problem.
No.
Yeah.
I haven't got the patience for it.
Yeah.
No, I don't. And one of the things I said in one of those columns I wrote was either at the end of the year or at the very beginning of 2005. I forget which New Year's resolution. I think it was a New Year's resolution for journalists. That's what it was.
Well, right. It's the same column,
And it's funny you should say that because I said, let's stop quoting all these spokespersons who...
As if they were the
person
officials.
elected. Now, let's say you can't reach Bloomberg. Let's say you can't reach Pataki, and you need to get an answer as to whether the lawn is green or blue. All right, so you can call the spokesman, and he'll say the lawn is green or the lawn is blue. But you don't then have to quote the spokesman saying, and anybody who says the lawn is purple belongs in Seattle, Washington, and we don't want him or her. I mean, they go on these tangents, which are basically political attacks, and we in the media quote them. And in my view, you want to attack somebody, particularly in a campaign, let the candidate do it. Why are we allowing these people who are their mouthpieces to attack someone who's running against their guy?
And then they have a degree of celebrity themselves. They become, and somebody's impact and chances of success are dependent on who they've hired. And there was a press secretary named Debs Myers, who I think is way before your time.
I remember the name.
But he had a great saying, hidden persuaders should remain hidden.
Yeah, I think it's gone over the top. And part of this is out of the journalistic impulse that I share to give both sides a chance to be heard. If somebody's attacking someone or someone is making an assertion, the other guy or gal the perspective ought to be there, but not the political rhetoric, the substance. That's my feel. I mean, I very rarely ever did that, and then I made this resolution that I'd be at the top of the list. I wouldn't do it at all, starting January 1st, 2005, and I haven't broken it yet.
How do you decide what you're going to write about?
Oh, Lord. Well, theoretically, I write about what interests me, but it has to be something that either goes beyond what's been in the news pages, something somebody hasn't had, a perspective someone hasn't had, because if it's something that someone else has written, then it's not really, it's hard to explain. It has to have an angle. And if it doesn't, then it's not really a column. It might as well be a news story, and in some cases it is. So it has to go beyond. So I might be interested in something, but it might have been written by somebody else already. The area may have been already explored. So I have to find an angle on a subject that interests me.
An angle doesn't necessarily mean conflict, though.
Often does.
It does.
Well, I'll give you you want an answer?
Yeah.
I'll give you a perfect example of a column I wanted to write, and I didn't, because it turned out, I had remembered it and looked it up, that a colleague, Clyde Haberman, who's my colleague who writes the NYC column, well, Clyde had written it about a year ago, something similar, and that was when these most recent terrible, they're always terrible, deaths of firefighters. And I wanted to write a column saying that it seems sad that they died trying to save people, just as firefighters and other emergency workers did on 9/11, and yet the amount of support, financial and otherwise, but particularly financial, that the widows and families of those who died on 9/11 were getting was so much greater. There was special funds set up and so on, and yet the men who died in those two fires was about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, will get something, of course, but they will get nothing.
Compared.
And I thought this was an interesting avenue to explore and to ask, what about our values and why is that? I wanted very much to write that. But Clyde had written something similar when a firefighter died in late 2003.
Yeah.
He had explored the issue. I didn't think that
So
I could
how
go...
did you know he did that?
I looked it up. Well, I had
You had
remembered
the-
it. I had
Right.
vaguely remembered it. I read all my colleagues' work.
Right.
I had vaguely remembered it, and I looked it up. You always look things up in the system, and I reread it, and I said, he did a great job. He's a great columnist. I really can't go beyond what Clyde said, except to change the names.
Yeah.
So I dropped
it.
I dropped it.
It's-
That's a perfect example. Now, that is an angle that you did not probably see, if I'm not wrong, in any other news
Right.
column, literally column, in the news pages of any newspaper. And it would be was a perfect column subject. It was done.
Right. And then you could take that. It's interesting because I just read today. I mean, you could take that and move it next to what we pay the families of the people who were killed in Iraq, which was $12,000.
That's right.
And now they've moved to do it. But it is such an uneven
They're
thing.
going to raise it
Have
now.
you noticed, I don't know if I'm imagining this, but over the years, the sentimentality that we have or something when somebody is killed or dies, it's different, isn't it? Do you remember years ago? Well, maybe we didn't have as many people being shot. That was
Yeah,
number one.
I don't know.
But I'm fascinated at the grottos and the flowers and all those things that happen at a scene, and I just can't remember if it's always been that way.
I was not that aware of it until Diana died.
Yeah, that's true.
Remember that?
Right.
But I think that there has always been an outpouring of both reportage and emotion and support when a firefighter or a police officer died. So I think that that when soldiers, the members of the military die in Iraq, it's something similar.
Yeah.
Yeah. And mayors, I certainly going back to Koch, probably before, always went to the funerals.
Yes, always. Always.
So I'm not sure. And then I think 9/11 heightened our understanding
Yeah.
of and sympathy for and respect for rescue workers.
Have you written a book? Are you
No.
writing a book?
No.
No? All right.
But if you have an idea,
I will call you.
Let me know.
Do you like people to call you?
I do. I prefer them to email me because I'm often not in the office, and then sometimes I'll get to a call too late.
So it's over. Thank you so much, and it's been
That
so
was
much
fast.
fun. And I hope you'll come back again, and we'll all read your column. And what days does it run?
Mondays and Thursdays.
Thank you very much.